In this session, we're going to be looking at rigour in qualitative research. The session objectives are to understand how rigour can be assessed in qualitative research and to be aware of methods of ensuring rigour in qualitative research. Now, as quantitative and qualitative research have fundamentally different values, there are concerns about how we could use traditional quantitative rigour measurements for qualitative research. This is because the concepts of reliability and validity were developed in the natural sciences. And because of this and a very different epistemological basis of qualitative research, there are real concerns about whether the same concepts have any value in determining the quality or sustainability of qualitative evidence. And because of such concerns, the idea of seeking validity and reliability in qualitative research is often avoided. Instead, writers discuss similar issues using terms and concepts that are felt to have greater resonance with the goals and values of qualitative research. Now, there are numerous alternative terms and concepts used in the literature when discussing rigour in qualitative research. In this video, we're going to look at 5 of these concepts in more detail, namely trustworthiness, credibility, confirmability, dependability, and finally transferability. Now, Lincoln and Gruber break down the overall trustworthiness of research into 5 areas, and we're going to look at these 5 areas in a little bit more detail now. The first area is credibility. And credibility asks the question, have we got good, relevant and valid data? And we can assess this by asking the question, did we ask the right questions and accurately capture the responses from those participants we talked to? The second area is dependability. And dependability asks the question, has the timing and/or context affected the data we've collected? And we can assess this by asking the question, did any out of the ordinary problems occur on the day of the data collection which might have impacted and influenced the answers we received? And the third criteria is confirmability. And confirmability asks the question, have we interpreted the data objectively? And we can assess this by considering, did we let our own perceptions as researchers affect our interpretations? And was there any bias? Did we allow our perceptions to influence the interpretation of the data and the results we drew? And finally, we can look at transferability. And transferability is concerned with the question, how useful is our research in other contexts? And we consider this by thinking about, would our results transfer to other contexts? Now, we don't want to seek generalizability and make our results generalizable, but if we can demonstrate that our results are transferable to other similar contexts, it will strengthen the results and arguments that we make. So let's consider what might compromise trustworthiness. Potential bias can have an impact on trustworthiness, and these can be split into 3 types of potential bias. Firstly, interviewer bias. And here we're concerned with, how are you asking the questions? What tones are we using? And also, what kind of non-verbal language are we demonstrating? And how the tones and how we present the questions and the non-verbal language we use might influence the respondent's or interviewee's response. The next type of bias that we want to consider is interviewee bias. And this is focused on whether the interviewees really want to answer your questions truthfully, or do they answer your questions truthfully? And of course, there might be reasons why they don't want to answer a particular topic or particular questions truthfully, such as concerns about safety, security, welfare, and this also touches on ethics. So we need to make sure that what we're asking is ethical. The final type of bias we need to consider is participation bias and who we've actually asked and the type of participants who have agreed to participate. We might have started off looking for numerous types of people to participate in our research, but there might be a particular type, maybe those who are more confident, who are willing to take part in our interviews, or maybe those who don't have sensitive data. So we have to be aware of the actual potential self-selecting nature of our sample and whether the participation and those participants who have engaged in our research have actually biased our overall results and interpretations we draw from the data. So what can researchers do to try and support the credibility, dependability, confirmability and transferability of the research? Now, there are some suggestions from within the literature. When it comes to credibility, it's suggested that we could use member checking, which is after we speak and/or interview participants, we go back to them with our data and some of our thoughts and interpretations from the data, and we go back and we check them and say, we have drawn these suggestions or these interpretations from the interview and the data you provided. Do you think this is correct? And by going back and checking with members who we interviewed, the thought is if they confirm that our interpretations we draw are correct, therefore we can support the credibility of our research. The second thing we can do to support the credibility of qualitative research is to use triangulation, where we draw several types of similar data on the same topic to support the conclusions drawn. So instead of only looking at interviews, we could potentially look at document analysis or observations to try and see if what people say is actually accurately reflected in what they do or what is written about a company. So for example, when it comes to asking people how they spend their time, people are often very bad at estimating what they do with their time, and actually we could observe them to try and triangulate whether the answers they're giving about using their time are actually true to what they do through observation and potentially document analysis. When it comes to dependability, in order to support our rigour in qualitative research, we need to carefully appreciate the timing and context surrounding the data collection. Therefore, we need to try and ensure that those we are interviewing and speaking to are in a normal context and fits in with their normal timing and schedule. For example, we're not trying to interview or observe people outside their normal working hours to see what they do. Because if we observe how people do their job after everyone else has gone home, we will get a different interpretation of what they do. So we need to make sure any qualitative data, whether it be interviews, observations, or focus groups, or anything else, we're careful to consider the timing and context to make sure that it's as normal as possible. Now, when it comes to considering confirmability and being able to demonstrate rigour that our data is confirmable, one suggestion is to use 2 or more people to analyse the data. This way we can ensure that different people have similar interpretations. If several people look at one data set and draw the same interpretations when analysing the data, we can demonstrate confirmability that actually what we see in the data set can be interpreted generally to be similar, and people aren't drawing completely different interpretations and conclusions from the same set of data. And finally, to consider transferability. Here we want to help the reader when assessing generalizability. So we need to be able to explain to the reader of our research how far our results can potentially be transferred. In what scenarios might things be similar? So we don't want to confuse transferability with generalizability, but we can strengthen our arguments if we can explain in what similar situations some of our findings might be transferable, and we open up our research to more situations through transferability. So finally, to conclude, on qualitative rigour, the researcher needs to provide comprehensive information about the data analysis processes and procedures that have been utilised within the research. It's important that the reader is able to reach their own conclusions regarding the trustworthiness of what has been done. Therefore, we need to provide as much information and potentially use more sources of data or member check with those we've taken the data from about the conclusions and interpretations drawn, or potentially explain to our readership how and in which ways our data will be transferable. And by doing the processes we've discussed in this short video, we can demonstrate and strengthen the rigour of our qualitative research.